All right, and can you see my screen all right? Okay. Well, welcome everybody. As I mentioned earlier, just before we started recording for, I don't know if any of you were here yet, just Mark, but I'm completely happy taking questions right in the middle of things if it's related to what I'm talking about. So feel free to post comments going. This presentation is going to be about an option to give your Drupal 7 site new life with Backdrop CMS, and it's in particular a case study of a recent project we did for Stanford BioX, taking their D7 site and upgrading it to Backdrop. By way of introduction, my name is Laren Kropp-Baker. I'm a Backdrop community member and a core committer for the project. I'm also a senior developer at Atten Design Group. We do strategy design and development for mission-driven organizations. We've been working with Drupal for over a decade and with Backdrop in the last few years, and we love contributing back to the projects every way that we can. Since 2000, we've been working with some of the most amazing mission-driven organizations in the world. We were founded to do work that matters. It's how we attract the clients we want to work with. It's how we attract the team we need, and it's one of the reasons I joined this team about 6 months ago. This case study is on the recent Drupal 7 to Backdrop upgrade we did for Stanford's BioX. You're probably familiar, but just in case, BioX is Stanford's pioneering interdisciplinary biosciences institute, bringing together biomedical and life science researchers, clinicians, engineers, physicists, and computational scientists to unlock the secrets of the human body. And that's at biox.stanford.edu. The situation at the start of the project was that they had a Drupal 7 site with some complexity to it. They didn't need to drastically change any of the information architecture. It was built well when it was built, and it had been holding up well for them over the years. There was a lot of content that needed to be preserved, and they were largely satisfied with how the site looked and functioned. In addition, their staff were knowledgeable in how to get everything done that needed to be done on the website. They've been trained and have learned well and used it for years. On top of all of this, of course, Drupal 7 end of life is looming. So the options that were considered were migrate to Drupal 9 or beyond, migrate to something else entirely, whether that be WordPress or something else, or upgrade to Backdrop CMS. In this case, when considering migration to Drupal 9 or Press or anything else, there's no clear need to do so because there wasn't any Drupal 9 specific functionality that was needed. Cost was factor, information architecture wasn't changing greatly, as I mentioned, and the fact that the content should be preserved meant that a migration process was going to be more intensive and costly. So the consideration of upgrading to Backdrop began to look very good because it solved the Drupal 7 end of life uncertainty. There's a direct upgrade path, not a migration process. So you can take your Drupal 7 site and upgrade it directly to Backdrop, which is part of why it can happen much more quickly and less expensively than a complete rebuild or migration. The information architecture, that is content types, fields, views, all of that will be preserved as part of the upgrade process. The content also remains in place, and at the end of the upgrade is as you would expect it to be, without having to do a migration process where you're exporting and pulling the data back into a new system. And there were even elements of the theme that could be reused. On top of all of that, as a bonus, as part of the upgrade, the improvements that have gone into Backdrop automatically would be applied on the new site, obviously. So there's improvements in accessibility, performance, usability, as well as new features that become available with Backdrop, which I'll talk in a little more depth about later, including configuration management and the layout system. Because of all this and the fact that it can help things go more quickly and smoothly, there can also then be extra room in the budget that can potentially be applied to other areas or improvements that aren't directly upgrade related. which I'll also touch on in a little more depth. So this is just for reference, a side-by-side comparison, the Drupal 7 site on the left from before the upgrade and a recent screenshot of the Backdrop site. So you can see how closely the upgraded site matches the source, and actually the few spots where you can see difference here were intentional changes, improvements that were made either during the upgrade process or afterwards in that post-upgrade improvements that are underway right now. And I'll talk a little bit more about those again. But as I was talking to Mark earlier, and he said, what even is Backdrop? So if you're not familiar, it's a fork of Drupal from the time in between Drupal 7 and 8. So it includes a lot of the improvements that went into Drupal 8, but it's taken very intentionally from the point right before a lot of the major structural changes in terms of like Symfony, Composer, Twig, and so on. The architectural changes to Drupal, which is why you can have an direct upgrade to Backdrop, but not to more modern versions of Drupal from Drupal 7. Some of the principles Backdrop project is based on is to make it easier to update. Backwards compatibility is important, so you can make improvements to the software, but you have to do it in a way that minimizes breakage for older sites. Simplicity, focusing on features that benefit the majority. One way that this is shown is that many of the most used modules from Drupal 7 that are on most Drupal 7 sites have been absorbed or taken into core in one way or another. It's not always just a copy the module into core and call it good, but it's the features from those modules have been incorporated into core in one way or another. And the goal of that is to make it easier for people to access those features without needing to know that there's a module, that they have to find the module and install it. But that if most people are using it, it's there out of the box. But still that it's extendable. There's a project installer you can browse directly from within the website, and if your your permissioning on your host will allow it, you can even download new modules and so on directly through the interface. Of course, security, performance are all important here as well, making sure that the sites can still run on, you don't need to have an enterprise level host necessarily. If your site is a small site, there's no need for that. Another thing that has happened is a predictable release schedule. So you can set, when the major releases are happening, and then the bug fixes in between, of course, but you can plan around those things. And then, of course, for free and open source. One of the concepts I wanted to talk about was the concept of the theme. So I'm going to be getting a little bit technical on a few of these next slides as I talk about some of the concepts, but I'll try not to get too deep into the weeds. In Drupal 7, your theme also defines your regions and your page structure. And so in Backdrop, this is split apart so that the theme controls the skin, the colors and fonts and so on. And a new layout system is meant to control the bones, the structure of the pages and so on. And to this particular case study, the goal was to recreate the existing theme without design. Other sites may wish to do the same, but you could also do a refresh of the theme or even a complete redesign at this point in upgrade. So for BioX, we were able to pull some sections of CSS directly from the existing site. We rewrote others just for getting them up to modernization and so on. And it's also possible to largely use some of the template files that may have been customized in a particular theme for Drupal 7, since Backdrop uses the same theme engine and format as Drupal 7 by and large. In terms of layouts, as I hinted at earlier, perhaps you're familiar with the blocks page on a Drupal 7 website where all the possible blocks are placed in the list form. And if you've got a lot of blocks, they can go way down the page, and then there's a header for a particular region, and then all the blocks that might be placed into that region. And you can click into each block and see the configuration settings for that block in terms of, are there any visibility conditions or things like that, where this block will only appear on certain pages. So it can get quite cumbersome on that list when you have many blocks. One of the major improvements that's gone into Backdrop is this concept of a layout. You can handle block placement on the page through the layouts, and they can lay out their own visibility conditions, and you can create any number of layouts. So, for example, you can have a layout that applies only to a certain content type or a text vocabulary and so on. And then within that layout, you can customize all the blocks, and the blocks can also additionally have their own visibility conditions. So as far as the structure of the layout, you can use any of the core provided layout templates as the basis of your layout, or you can create a custom template in code, or even build a flexible layout template directly in the user interface. And that will provide you all the regions which were previously defined in your theme. For BioX, since we were doing an upgrade, we wanted to create a layout template that had all the regions which matched the regions that were available in the theme from Drupal 7. And this would make it easy to make sure the blocks that had been placed in a particular spot in Drupal 7 could then be in the matching spot in the new Backdrop site. So this is just a sample. It's not actually the layout template from BioX, because that was so big it would have been hard to read the writing. I reduced it a little bit for being able to see some of the words, but it's a sample screenshot of what the drag and drop interface can look like. So you can drag blocks from one region to another. You can add blocks with the buttons here. And then you can configure individual blocks as well to set up visibility conditions or other configuration settings related to the block. I mentioned earlier that there's a direct upgrade path, and that's one of the reasons it can be so much more affordable to move to Backdrop instead of a modern Drupal. The content, terms, users, all that will transfer directly. Many of the most used modules are already either in core or ported and available in Backdrop. And there are tools to help you check and see if the ones you're using on your Drupal 7 site are all ready to go, and to help you with the upgrade planning. The Backdrop status or the D2B migrate modules can be helpful there to test those out. And even if there are modules you're using that aren't ported yet, generally speaking, it's not that hard to port modules from Drupal 7 to Backdrop, and that can be wrapped into an upgrade project, cost of an upgrade, without adding too much overhead. In the case of the BioX website, we could remove some modules that weren't really needed after all, and there's no point in upgrading those. There was a number of modules that we did need to port, and there were a number that we needed to polish a little bit to make sure the upgrade process went smoothly. We kept good notes, ran the upgrade process many times locally until it became so smooth we were ready to do it for the final time. One thing I need to make special mention of here is configuration management, because that's also an improvement that's gone into Backdrop that is super helpful in this process. So we could be doing one of our upgrade trial runs locally. We could be working, changing views, changing layouts, changing configuration, and then do a configuration export, which will take all of the configuration we've just been tweaking and save it in a staging folder, which can then become part of the version control, the files that were in version control. And then, when it comes time to take a fresh database dump from the live site, you can prepare it, re-import it, do the upgrade process again, and then a simple configuration sync will take all that staging configuration and reintroduce it on top of the fresh copy of the site's content. So we can just where we left off. And that made things super smooth and super easy. As we went every step of the way, I tried to add to, edit, remove items from notes to self document. And this could be things like warnings we came across or errors. And wherever possible, we would submit a patch to core or to a module so that would become incorporated in, and others wouldn't have to run into the same issue. And then it was also related to this process of taking a fresh database dump and preparing it and then doing the upgrade. Sometimes we would find things that were content related, so we couldn't really change those locally and have them saved because we wanted to get fresh copies of the content repeatedly. So there were a few things, a few notes related to content that we took. And then where we could, we actually typed into the notes to self document little scripts or drush commands or B commands that could do the things that needed to happen very, very quickly. One example I list here is we came across some old pages that had URLs that were outdated, like the domain had changed at one point, and we could run a script that updated those all. So as part of the upgrade, the site content actually got fixed up in a number of places as well. And then we kept an opportunities list as well. And that's things that weren't necessarily in scope for the upgrade process, but I wanted to make note of them so that after the upgrade was complete, we could come back and say, here's a list of things that could get worked on if you want to prioritize them, if there's room in the budget, etc. And so we had those all collected in a list at the end of the process. And all of this led up to the final upgrade run through. And so at this point, we just had to download the live database, import it locally, run through that list of steps. On D7, we would be using the drush commands wherever possible, and then export a backdrop ready database for ready for upgrade. And then we ran a few scripts here, as I mentioned, for changing some of the URLs particularly, and then import that locally, sync configuration, and we were ready. In the end, this process went so well that we only needed 1 day of content freeze, and the time from when we downloaded the live database to when we had a fully upgraded backdrop database locally was only about half an hour. Running through that script took about half that document. In addition, we finished the upgrade 2 months early, and we used only just a little bit more than half of the allotted budget for the entire upgrade project.
Larry, and I hate to interrupt, but Casey has her hand up.
Okay, no, that's.
Yeah, I didn't know if you wanted to take questions, in the middle or wait, but
Totally
just curious if BioX, did they use, or they using Simple SAML PHP or some other way to connect to Stanford login? And was that part of the upgrade?
Yes, yeah, they are using Simple SAML PHP, and that had been ported actually by Atten on another project. But we did, as part of this process, we did make additional polishing to that module for Backdrop, so that is available for Backdrop. Yeah,
cool.
So all that earlier to say, we finished early and had a bunch of the budget left over because it went so smoothly. That efficiency has left extra time for us to go through this opportunities list, for example, and make improvements and tweaks that weren't part of the initial upgrade process necessarily, but will make the website better in the end. Some of the improvements that just come automatically with the upgrade in Backdrop Core, and there's a ton of them. I've just got a few examples here, but it runs faster in Drupal 7. It has a basic image library that ties together image fields and images uploaded into CK Editor directly. So you can upload something in CK Editor and then reference it in the image library from an image field on a different page and not have to upload it multiple times. There are administrative menu improvements with icons and menu search. So if you're familiar with that type of thing, if you know the command, but you don't know where it is in the menu, you can start typing the command and it'll highlight in the menu where other types of information about the current page that you're on, and so on. Many other UI improvements and adjustments, accessibility improvements. One of my favorites, I mentioned the main menu earlier. So it's keyboard, you can navigate via keyboard out of the box. And as part of this project, we actually submitted an improvement for accessibility on the mobile version, where you can, the type of interaction that you're going to have there, where you know, the way that you interact on the collapsed mobile menu is an option instead of just having to select or having to accept the default. So here's an example screenshot. You can see the menu is themed and looks very similar to what was on the Drupal 7 site. There's a few things that are added for accessibility purposes, some contrast changes and so on. And then the way it breaks down on mobile with the expanding buttons and stuff. In terms of customized improvements, these are ongoing. Some examples that we have been able to make or are in the process of making on BioX. Image conversion to next generation format. You may have seen that notification if you run like page speed insights, or you know, you're trying to test your page load and so on. So we've set it up to allow automatic conversion on image fields, for example, so that they are converted to WebP format. Some minor adjustments to the information architecture. We didn't have to recreate from scratch, but we could, you know, using tools that are available after the fact, we could merge certain content types, split vocabulary. So like there were a few certain key terms that were in the tags field, but they were being used in a way that really they could have been pulled out separately. So we were able to pull those out into a separate field, and it's a usability improvement. Improved authoring experience compared to Drupal 7, beginning to implement some options with paragraphs to build pages more richly, but still in a structured way. Better social sharing with meta tags and a specific image style for social media sharing. So when you share a page on Facebook, it now has that big image and it has the little BioX logo in the bottom right and things like that, just for those little touches. Other tweaks for, we have made other tweaks for accessibility, usability. We're working on some changes for search that'll help make things better for users. And then we're working on some ways to, they've, as mentioned, they've had this very rich content over all these years, and they've done a ton of work in cross-linking and referencing content. And as part of the opportunities, we noticed there's ways that can be exposed to the end user in helpful ways that will probably help not just the user experience of finding relevant content, but also probably help with search engine optimization and the like. Oops. So here's just one of the screenshots of the little tweaks to the user interface that we did after the fact. On the left, here's how it appeared on Drupal 7, and as we were working in the opportunities document, again, we noted all this stuff that's getting pulled in from Vimeo. If that was gone, it would be a lot cleaner. This formatting with just some minor tweaks can look a lot nicer, and also use listing, or on these video listing pages, which are done in views, the titles were not linked because they were just all collected by terms, for example, and the individual video pages existed, but they weren't able to get to them very easily. So making the titles into a link, again, good for user experience, good for search engine optimization, and just general cleanliness of the interface. So those are some of the basic examples. I've put together some of this in a one-pager in case you want to take it back to your team, which you can download here. I've also got some time for questions, whether it's something I touched on, whether it's a question on something I didn't touch on. I'm happy to field anything you've got for me now or later. My email, you can just use Laryn, Laryn @atom.io, or that URL there to get the one pager.
I have a question. Lauren, I don't know if you talked about this, but about like custom codes, custom modules, how does it handle that?
Very well. So because of this commitment to minimize breaking changes, many of the APIs that would have been used in custom modules are all still there, and function, if not exactly the same, very similarly. There are some things that do need tweaking and changing, but and I don't have specific data, but I'm just going to throw a number out there, like 80 to 90% of the code won't need to be touched. And if you've got custom modules, there's actually a contributed module called Coder Upgrade that you can on custom modules or modules that contributed modules that haven't been ported yet. And it will do a lot of the grunt work in terms of converting variables into configuration, that kind of thing, and do all that for you to get you kind of a push start.
And I'm guessing this sticks with more of the procedural programming.
Definitely more of it. Yeah, it's the like, for example, the block system, like all of the block hooks that you would have in Drupal 7 will continue to function as kind of legacy blocks. There's also like in core, many of the blocks have been converted to using more object-oriented approach. So there's both can be found in places, but definitely much more on the procedural side. I see a hand there, Luke.
Hey, I apologize if you mentioned this earlier, but can you tell me how long the whole process took? Like when did it start? How long requirements? How long implementation?
Yeah, I don't have a specific break, but the entire thing was in the realm of 2 months. Around that. Yes, so I see in the comments here, Arena has
yeah, Arena said that they do have a fork of Decanter that is for Backdrop. Decanter is the pattern library that Stanford uses, so that should help people who are interested in migrating to Backdrop and wanting to use the Stanford colors, themes, fonts, all those things.
Thank you for that. Looks like I talked fast. I can answer general questions about Backdrop too, if you've got them. Not specific to upgrading, but otherwise we can.
Well, I think one thing we talked about before we started, you kind of mentioned that one thing that I thought found interesting was you kind of mentioned that this is kind of an intermediary between 7 and 8. I think that's kind of interesting, and I guess that kind of like raises questions like, what's the future for Backdrop? Is it just kind of like stay in the lane that it's in, or is it eventually going to go in that direction? Or do you know?
Can you clarify what you mean by that direction?
Like kind of staying in kind of a traditional, the Drupal 7 like having like the procedural, using sort of the traditional like Drupal 7 way of doing things, or is it going to become more like Drupal 8, Drupal 9, where it's more, dependency management and stuff like that?
I suspect it will not become more like Drupal 8 or 9 in that regard. I think there's definitely the possibility, like probably way down the road, that APIs can change and things like that. But for the moment, it's in this minimizing breakage kind of focus, and that's intentional. So I don't, and that's part of the principles. So I don't think that's going to suddenly switch like Backdrop 2.0 is going to suddenly be like, Drupal 10 or something like that in terms of the underlying architecture. But I do think that right now it's probably as close as it's ever going to be, and it will drift just by the nature of being its own project. There are plenty of people in the Backdrop community work with both Drupal and Backdrop, and it's not uncommon to see an issue in the Backdrop queue that says like, oh, I was working on Drupal and I saw this, or this particular thing has always bothered me in Drupal. Can we fix it here? So there's still a lot of Drupal differential comments in terms of changes that could come into Backdrop, but I think it's safe to say that this underlying change that will break everything will not happen in Backdrop.
Is the frequency or method of security updates similar to what we've seen on Drupal?
Yeah, so that's also right now, because they're so closely related right now. Now that's kind of tightly integrated, and I think it will. My understanding is it will continue to be integrated going forward, because there will still be things that affect both. And so we have integration among the Drupal security team and the Backdrop security team, try to make releases on the same day when they're related to both projects and that kind of thing. There's also, the security team is also a standalone security team. So there are issues that would only affect Drupal. There are issues that would only affect, and those would be, handled separately. But I think that especially with the way that Drupal 7 still has 400,000 sites, it's going to continue getting some type of, if not official support, type of more long-term support that will probably keep seeing security releases from Drupal 7, and where applicable, those would be matched up with Backdrop as well. So. One thing that I'll note, if you're, I mentioned in the presentation about the project browser, where you can browse and install modules if your permissioning allows it on your host. That system also allows you through the UI to do core updates. So for some of the smaller sites that allows it, it can be a real win to be able to manage those core updates themselves without having to get into SSH or FTP or however they used to have to do that. It can just be done point and click through the UI. So
how do you manage the security of that downloading and writing to the file system based on something that someone can choose through the UI?
That question, I haven't been involved in the underlying code on that, so I can't really answer that, but a good segue for me to say, Backdrop has a pretty robust live chat community, people who are pretty eager to answer and give help and answer questions, and that's on Zulip. I'll put that in the chat here as well, so you can ask that question, or if you, I'm happy to do some legwork on and get back to you if you want to see an email or a contact for you. That's the link to the live chat.
Yeah, if you can post the do you have the SAML PHP integration repo?
Yep, I can do that.
That'd be great.
So Backdrop,
Thank you.
yeah, the contrib space and even the core development all happens on GitHub.
All right, any more questions? Going once, going twice, 3 times. All right.
This is really
thanks.
informative. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Appreciate
and
it.
if you think of anything after the fact, feel free to contact me separately anytime. It's no problem.
Do you want to put your information up again, just for
Sure.
in case anyone didn't catch it the first time.
If I can find it again.
Although maybe it's probably on webcam.
Yeah, here, I'll just put my email address here, and then anybody's free to send me a message there. Thank you all for